On July 12, 1804, one of the greatest founding fathers of the United States took a shot in a duel with the sitting vice president. The next day, Alexander Hamilton was dead, but his legacy of protectionism remains to this day.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
The debate on tariffs is one of the oldest and most heated debates in economics and politics. If it were a simple good or bad issue, we probably would have settled it by now, but we haven't. So to get a better understanding of it, we are raising some questions today. What are tariffs? How have they shaped US history? And what do they mean in the context of today's world economy? Let's break this down with a story, because honestly, tariffs can sound complicated, but they're really not. So every year, my big family has this Christmas trading ritual. It's a huge deal. Everyone's there. All the cousins, second cousins, and even that one uncle who shows up only for the food. And we trade our old clothes with each other. Some of us take it very seriously. My brothers, for example, barely wear their clothes all year just so they can sell them at a higher price to our cousin Kelly. We don't really like Kelly. This year, I invited my friend over for the ritual. My dad doesn't really like my friend's dad, the Johnsons. You see, the Johnsons own a clothing factory, and my friend took the ritual seriously, like way too seriously. The guy showed up with brand new high quality clothes, actually factory made stuff, and he was selling them dirt cheap. Suddenly, we were able to buy better clothes with cheaper prices, and everyone was thrilled, except my brothers. They were the ones who usually made the most profit every year, and thanks to my friend's industrial grade clothes, they were out of business. So what did they do? They ran to my dad, complained that this wasn't fair. Now, my dad didn't need much convincing. He already didn't like the fact that the Johnsons are coming to our ritual, so he went straight to them and said, if your son wants to sell his clothes at our market, he has to pay me $10 per piece of clothing. The next day, my friend showed up, less excited obviously, because he had to raise his prices to make up for the money he had to pay my dad. And suddenly, his clothes weren't such a steal anymore. And guess what? A lot of us just went back to buying from our own family. And with that, the debate began. Some of us were mad that we couldn't buy good clothes at cheap prices anymore. Others were happy they could finally sell their own stuff again. And my dad, well, he just made a nice little profit from the situation. And that is exactly how tariffs work in the real world. Ever wonder why we can't decide whether they're good or bad? Well, it's because they affect different people in completely different ways. The first group who loves tariffs are usually the domestic producers, the businesses inside the country that suddenly find themselves losing customers to cheaper foreign competition. And they have a point. Not every country started at the same time or had the same advantages. Some nations develop industries faster, some have cheaper labor, and some have government subsidies that help them sell their products at ridiculously low prices. So what happens when a small business in one country is suddenly competing with a massive foreign corporation that's already ahead? They struggle. They lose sales, factories shut down, and jobs disappear. And honestly, that logic makes sense. But then there's the other side, the free traders, the globalizers, the people who believe that competition isn't a threat, it's an opportunity. They're basically like my sister Diana. Now, if you don't know Diana, she's all about resilience, about grinding through the pain. When my dad stepped in and protected my brothers with the $10 tariff, Diana was furious. She told my dad, if you keep giving them special treatments, they're never going to improve, they'll get spoiled, they'll stop innovating, and that's not good for anyone. And honestly, she has a point too. And there's the part we even forgot to mention. You remember my cousin Fred, the one who worked with the Johnsons? Yeah, they don't buy from him anymore. Why? Because tariffs don't happen in a vacuum. When one country raises tariff, other country retaliates. And who gets caught in the crossfires? Exporters. So the real question isn't whether tariffs are good or bad. It is simple. Who has more sway over my dad? Now, there's a key difference between how tariffs played out in my family's Christmas market and how they operate in the real world. To understand it, we need to talk about why Mexican Coke is different from American Coke. Yeah, I know, it sounds random, but trust me, this is where things start making sense. You see, the price of sugar in the US is way higher in most other countries. Why? Because of a long-standing quota on sugar imports. That causes Coke producers in the US to use other materials like high fructose corn syrup. While this policy raises costs for almost every American consumer, the impact is so small, just a few cents per person, that it goes unnoticed by the public. But for the handful of sugar companies making billions, they absolutely care, and they lobby aggressively to make sure the tariff stays. This is what makes tariffs so hard to get rid of. The benefits are concentrated, but the costs are scattered. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand how tariffs shaped US history. Tariffs were there from the very beginning of the US Constitution, and for most of it, they were the backbone of the federal government's income. Back in the early days, the US didn't have income taxes, so tariffs had two opposing goals: revenue for the government and protection for industries. Can you see the problem? If you push tariffs too high, fewer goods are imported, meaning less tax revenue for the government. If you keep tariffs too low, you aren't really protecting your industries as much as you wanted to. So for most of the 19th century, the US tried to walk this tightrope, balancing government funding with industrial protection. The biggest advocate for protectionism among the founding fathers was Alexander Hamilton, who wanted America to stop relying on foreign goods and start building its own industries. In 1791, Hamilton laid out his vision in the Report on Manufacturers, with his argument about the need for protecting infant industries. You see, Britain and Europe had already been industrialized, so Hamilton suggested tariffs to make imported goods more expensive, giving local industries a chance to catch up. Hamilton laid the intellectual foundation for protective tariffs, but his policies remained relatively moderate. It wouldn't be until later that protectionism really took over US economic policy. Because after the War of 1812 cut off trade between the US and Britain, Americans realized something. They were dangerously dependent on foreign goods. Then this guy came around, Henry Clay, basically the 19th century Trump. Clay was one of the most influential politicians of the 19th century. He introduced a bold economic strategy built on high tariffs, infrastructure investment, and a strong national bank to stabilize the economy. The high protective policies of Clay, although meant for protecting infant industries, gave birth to a whole new industry, the lobbying industry. By keeping foreign competition out, tariffs allowed domestic producers to sell at artificially high prices. And once businesses got a taste of that protection, they didn't want to give it up. Congress became flooded with special interest lobbying. So, for most of the 19th century, tariffs remained high, averaging above 40%, and they led to the flourishment of American industries. Some argued that they thrived despite high tariffs, not because of them, but we're not here to chase that rabbit hole. What is undeniable is this: industries grew, tariffs existed, and corruption grew right alongside them. That growth continued right up to the First World War, where the Underwood Tariff of 1913 slashed rates from 40 to 50% to 20% and replaced the lost government revenue with the 16th Amendment, a federal income tax. And it worked amazingly. The government didn't need tariff revenue anymore. And you'd think that would be the end of it, but you'd be forgetting about the second goal of tariffs. Entrenched special interests had amassed so much power that when the economy started to slow down in the late 1920s, they pushed to raise tariffs again. By 1930, in the wake of the Great Depression's onset, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, pushing rates back to 60%, the highest in a century. By 1933, global trade collapsed, plummeting from $3 billion in early 1929 to just $900 million, worsening the economic crisis. So how did we end up with the low tariffs and free trade in the second half of the 20th century? It wasn't just a sudden shift in ideology. Three forces were at play. Inflation did most of the work. You see, most US tariffs were based on specific duties, a fixed amount per unit rather than a percentage of the item's value. So, for example, let's say the tariffs on a $1,000 car was $500, an effective rate of 50%. But if inflation pushed the price of the same car to $2,000, the effective rate would be 25%. The second thing was the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Acts of 1934.
April 2nd, reciprocal tariffs tariffs kick in.
RTAA changed the game by giving the president the power to negotiate trade deals with other countries, and that same idea led to the development of the Global Agreements on Trade and Tariffs in 1947 and the World Trade Organization in 1995. The third factor was that World War II wiped out most of Europe's industrial base. Before World War II, import competing industries were the loudest voice in Washington, but now Republican senators suddenly wanted access to foreign markets. Instead of my brothers controlling my dad's decision, now my cousin Fred, the one who sells to the Johnsons, held more sway. For decades, the world moved toward free trade, but today tariffs are back on the table. Major economies are reconsidering protectionism, and politicians are pushing tariffs as a way to save jobs. But now we know better. Tariffs aren't just about protecting workers, they're also a tool for special interest groups to secure government favors. We now understand the trade-offs of tariffs. I'm not going to try and calculate the exact effects of today's proposed tariffs. You can check what experts say about that. But before we wrap this up, let's take a look at what happened when the US tried tariffs in 2018. The first Trump tariffs were one of the most aggressive tariff policies in modern history. Trump imposed tariffs on $283 billion worth of US imports, with rates ranging from 10% to 50%. Did these tariffs make money? Technically, yes. The tariffs on China alone brought in $66 billion from 2018 till 2020. But this money came straight from US consumers and businesses. Foreign exporters didn't lower their prices. Instead, the entire cost of the tariffs were passed on to American buyers, so in reality, it was a tax on Americans. In the case of washing machines, for example, consumers paid $1.5 billion per year due to higher washing machine prices. And the US did create 1,800 new jobs in the washing machine industry alone, but each of those jobs effectively cost $850,000 per year, way more than what any of those workers were actually earning. China's retaliation also hammered US agriculture, leading to massive losses for farmers. The US government had to bail out farmers with $61 billion. That money nearly wiped out the $66 billion in revenue from the tariffs on China. Today's proposed tariff policies are even bigger than the 2018 tariffs. It's way too soon to know what the final impact will be, whether the cost of protecting jobs and national security will actually add up to a net positive is something only time will tell. But what we do know is that tariffs aren't as simple as politicians make them sound. And with this new perspective, we can bring more nuance to the conversations we have about them.